World War II is likely the deadliest conflict that has ever occurred in the world. How could it have been prevented? I say realistically, but any alternative development in our story is essentially unrealistic. Don't take this too seriously, for I'm not a historian, just a guy making videos on the internet. Nevertheless, here are a few theories I devised to consider possible ways to prevent the onset of World War II. All theories will be evaluated based on two parameters: realism, how likely they are to be implemented, and impact, how much they could help prevent war. One of the most famous ideas on how to prevent World War II is that the Allies should have abandoned appeasement and stopped Germany before it seized Czechoslovakia. At first glance, this seems reasonable, but it overlooks the main problem. Even if Germany were stopped in Czechoslovakia, the nationalist regime would likely remain in power. This means a weaker Germany, but it seems to me that its leadership could still declare war on Czechoslovakia, or perhaps Poland, drawing France and Britain into conflict. I believe the conference in Munich could not have stopped Germany's ambitions if the Allies had shown firmness, so war would have been inevitable, just on a smaller scale. A weaker Germany might have prevented France's fall, and optimistically, the Soviet Union could have better resisted a weaker Germany. However, the conference's resolution in Munich against Germany is unlikely, as the Allies wanted to buy time. For this to happen, Chamberlain should not have been prime minister, and France should have pursued a more aggressive policy against Germany. Both of these conditions are practically unrealistic. In terms of realism, I would rate the possibility of stopping Germany at the Munich conference as 2 out of 10. As for influence, I already mentioned that the nationalists in Germany would still remain in power. They just wouldn't have managed to get Czechoslovakia without a fight, so they would likely have started the war sooner or later, just on a smaller scale. Therefore, the influence could be rated 3.5 out of 10. The Führer of Germany is often referred to as an Austrian artist. Many of us know that he did not attend art school, which later led him to write a book and enter politics. An interesting question. What would have happened if he had been accepted into art school? If he had been eliminated, for example, during World War I, he could have been shot or killed in another way. The removal of the Führer of Germany would have had significant consequences. Let me explain why. Many quickly assert that his removal would not change the situation, as someone like Martin Bormann, Rudolf Hess, Joseph Goebbels, or even Heinrich Himmler could take his place. Some believe that removing the Austrian artist automatically eliminates German ultranationalism. The party, of course, could not easily come to power, as Germany still felt the humiliation after the Great War and the Great Depression. Therefore, ultranationalists could still rise, but with some differences. In my opinion, the Austrian artist would become a unifying force for all nationalist parties. His removal or successful admission to the art school would deprive them of this unifying element, slowing the growth of ultranationalists, but not stopping it. Ultranationalists could have come to power a bit later than in 1933, possibly in 1936, after the referendum on the Sarn Basin concluded in favor of Germany. Ultranationalists are unlikely to immediately expand or remilitarize the Rhineland, as the German army and high command still do not trust the nationalists. Historically, officers of the German army were skeptical of the plans of an Austrian artist to militarize the Rhine region in 1936, fearing it could lead to war with France. This is important because without the Austrian artist, Germany will become ultra-nationalistic much later, allowing them to militarize the Rhineland around 1938 if we maintain the same historical dates and try to annex Austria in 1940. Thus, the Germans are 2 years behind schedule. France and Britain adopted a policy of appeasement, as they were severely affected by the Great Depression, which officially began in 1929 and ended in 1939. This time, the Germans will begin aggressive actions when the Allies are already ready for war. This means that the policy of appeasement will likely not occur in this alternative history, as the Allies will already be prepared for war and will emerge from the economic crisis caused by the Great Depression. Germany will be able to militarize the Rhineland again, but do not expect anything more. The Allies will have time to restore their relations with Italy and try to win it over to their side, which is not guaranteed, but quite possible. In general, a world without the Austrian artist will lead to a lack of tranquility, as the West will have more time to strengthen by the time the ultra-nationalists come to power in Germany. Nevertheless, I expect that war will still occur, possibly due to Austria, with the formation of a front and the intervention of allies, even if Austria decides to become an ally of Germany. The French, British, and Poles, as well as potentially other states, may attack the Axis. This war will mainly be limited to Europe, but its outcome will be quite swift, and we can avoid the catastrophic losses characteristic of World War II if one person had been accepted into art school or removed during the Great War. In terms of realism, I would rate it at 7.5, as simply getting the artist into art school wouldn't be impossible if he really tried hard, or if someone else encountered him during the Great War and decided to eliminate the opponent. As for the impact, I would also rate it at 7.5, as the war would be less deadly and limited. You may disagree with this, and I would be happy to read your comments and corrections. This is my favorite assumption about how World War II could have been prevented in 1918. Immediately after the dissolution of Austria-Hungary, the German Austria Republic emerged, claiming rights to these territories, but control over most current borders was already established. Since Dant had promised the Sudetenland to Czechoslovakia, the demands of German Austria would not be respected. Italy would also have captured South Tyrol, so Austria could claim rights to these lands, but ultimately would not be able to hold them. At that time, Germany and Austria were negotiating the creation of an alliance, and their unification in 1918 or 1919 would be complex, but I believe it is not impossible. An obvious advantage of such a scenario would be that ultra-nationalism would hardly gain popularity in Germany, as the Weimar Republic could have been more stable, considering that Germany loses territories but gains Austria, which in turn could have prevented disaster. There was support for this movement for unification both in Germany and Austria, so if the question were put to a democratic vote between these countries, the likely result would favor the union. Both countries considered themselves German and were governed by social democratic parties, although they had differences in religion. But what prevented them from uniting? It was the Treaty of Versailles, which prohibited Austria from joining Germany, and later, Germany was also forbidden to annex Austria. The situation could have been changed with the help of the United States, which should have been more actively involved. The ideas of self-determination introduced by Woodrow Wilson could have been used by Austria and Germany. I can imagine that they would have held a referendum before signing the Versailles Treaty, which historically took place at the end of 1919, about a year after the end of the Great War. If a referendum were to take place in Germany and Austria, and suppose the people voted for unification, this result could become too significant to ignore, especially considering the demonstrations for the Union in major cities of Germany and Austria. I could mention all the problems associated with this, but for now, I want to explore the positives. Germany is losing land in the east and west, but is also gaining land in the south, which practically offsets their losses. For me, this would make the rise of nationalists practically impossible in this new Germany. Of course, there would be nationalist and militarist parties, but none of them would become too popular or even form a dictatorship. Social Democrats would likely remain in power by uniting with their Austrian colleagues. Although Italy would probably still lean towards ultra-nationalism, they would unlikely start a world war, while Stalin and the Soviet Union exercised caution in their relations with the West, avoiding provocations. This is about how Germany and Austria would unite in 1919, and how it could reflect on the 30s and 40s. If the Second World War could have been avoided, it might have led to the development of nuclear weapons in the 1950s, making potential conflict even more deadly. Considering mutual assured destruction, a mass war could have been prevented, Germany would have remained democratic, and leading scientists would not have left the country, allowing research in atomic and rocket technology to continue. I would rate this influence a 9 or 10, as it would significantly reduce the chances of a world war, unlike other scenarios where World War II still occurs, but on a smaller scale and with fewer casualties. However, there is bad news. This is an unlikely scenario, especially considering the opposition from France and Britain. The United States would have had more influence on France and Britain, ironically, if Germany had been stronger, which could have prolonged World War I by several months or even a year. France and Britain were already in significant debt to the Americans, and prolonging the conflict would only worsen the situation. By the end of the war, they would become more dependent on America, which could lead them to accept the results of an alternative referendum. Another problem was Karl Renner, who led the Republic of Austrian Germany. He was a Marxist, and the Austrians did not fully trust him, so his removal from the scenario would significantly improve the chances of successful developments. However, this would make the situation even less realistic. I would rate it a 5 or 6 for realism. Germany would have to change to prolong the war, while France and Britain would have to respect the referendum on the unity of Germany and Austria, which at the time would have been highly controversial for France, which sought to completely divide Germany rather than grant it additional territories. Therefore, the success of this scenario requires too much, although it is still possible. This is definitely a strange option, but I include it because I find it historically interesting. After the Franco-Prussian War, from 1870 to 1871, France became a republic. The new government supported the idea of restoring the monarchy, but with the Orleanist dynasty, the only reason this did not happen was the existence of the Orleans claimant to the throne, Henry, who was deeply conservative and wanted to change the flag of France. This conflict led to the organization of opposition, and France remained a republic. However, if the Orléans had agreed to the future of France, the monarchy could have been restored. This event in 1871 could have prevented the Second World War 68 years later. Although this is not very realistic either, it is an interesting thought, as if France were a monarchy, it would have been less tolerant of socialists, which would have significantly changed the country in the interwar period, of course, if the Orléans had remained in power for so long. Although historically the front in France is perceived as weakening the country from within, making France less stable, it also means that it cannot project its power beyond its borders. Of course, France, remaining a monarchy, could have avoided World War I, but perhaps this is the most realistic way France could have pressured Germany in 1939. When the war began, it was no secret that Germany heavily relied on its forces in the invasion of Poland. The High Command did not expect France and Britain to defend the Poles, so when they declared war on Germany, a brief panic arose among international observers. The Germans concentrated 80% of their forces on fighting Poland, while the remaining part of the army guarded France. But these soldiers often lacked experience, as the professional army was fighting in Poland. Historically, France briefly invaded Saarlandia, encountering minimal resistance. Instead of continuing the offensive, they chose to retreat behind defensive lines, which later allowed Germany to regroup and ultimately capitulate to France. This situation could have changed if the Bourbon House had been at the head of France. Yes, it would have been a constitutional monarchy, but the threat of socialism would have been less relevant, which, I hope, would have led to a more united France capable of responding to Germany's actions. I suppose France is unlikely to stop and will continue to attack Germany in 1939. If all goes well, the Germans will be pushed back across the borders, although Poland will ultimately fall due to the Soviet invasion. Thus, a period of phony war will arise when France will hold the western bank of the Rhine River, and Germany will try to reclaim it, likely acting through the Boer. How this scenario will unfold, we will never know, but it is clear that World War II would have happened anyway. Although this is an interesting idea about the proper invasion of France into Germany at the start of the war, it is unlikely to change the outcome. Another interesting thought is what could have happened if France had invaded Germany in 1936, when the Rhineland was demilitarized. However, I will mention this later. Speaking of realism, the rise to power of the House of Orleans would be possible if the flag issue were resolved, and in that case, they would likely have attacked Germany at the beginning of the war, provided nothing impeded this scenario. I would rate this hypothesis 6 points for realism and 2 or 3 for impact. When Germany remilitarized the Rhineland, the world did not pay much attention, although it was a clear violation of the Versailles Treaty. Poland was the most active country opposing Germany at that time, planning an invasion of Germany in 1923 and 1933, but they were stopped by France and Britain. This is actively discussed among historians, but the main theory is that France and Britain promised to protect Germany if Poland decided to invade in 1933, which made the Poles retreat. This spurred Germany to take more aggressive actions. The expansionist policy, as he knew, was supported by France and Britain. He was even surprised when these two countries declared war on Germany to protect Poland. It is worth noting that historians still debate whether this actually happened, so it is more of a popular theory than a fact. In any case, in 1936, Poland could have asked France to jointly invade Germany to overthrow the nationalists and restore democracy in Germany. But France was too stubborn and was dealing with internal problems, so it refused. The reason France could not respond to this request was the Great Depression, which severely impacted the French economy. France was forced to devalue its currency to stimulate exports, and its economy was in a dire state. Moreover, the country had to deal with the People's Front movement, which posed a threat of socialist revolution to France. The French government understood that if they invaded Germany and did not achieve immediate victory, socialists, communists, and anarchists could rise up, taking advantage of the war situation, leading to a civil war and turning France communist, as happened during the Russian Civil War. This is why France was so cautious about the prospect of war with Germany. However, if one were to step back from realism, France could at least support Poland in its invasion of Germany, but not get too involved in this alternative historical event. Poland could ask France to declare war, and for some reason, France might agree. Perhaps they wanted to demonstrate that Germany was violating the Versailles Treaty and show their strength. Historically, they should have declared war on Germany as soon as possible. What if this had happened in 1936? Germany would have found itself in an extremely difficult situation. That year, its army was minimal, as it was just beginning a secret rearmament.